Before sunrise, the operational picture at Lake Powell is already assembled from several systems that do not usually appear on the same screen. The Bureau of Reclamation is tracking the reservoir surface, inflow, storage, releases through Glen Canyon Dam, and the amount of water expected to arrive during the remaining months of the water year. Snow monitoring agencies are watching what is left in the mountains. Power operators are watching how much electricity the dam can produce as the water level falls. River managers are watching the legal and physical obligation to continue moving water downstream. None of those readings describes the crisis by itself. Together, they show a reservoir being asked to release water faster than the basin can reliably replace it. In mid-July, provisional federal measurements placed Lake Powell near 3,524 feet above sea level. That position was roughly 24 feet below the elevation. Federal planners had once treated as a protective buffer and only about 34 feet above minimum power pool. The surface had continued falling even after the season, when snowmelt normally gives the reservoir its strongest inflow. That is the first abnormal signal. Lake Powell is not entering spring and waiting for mountain snow to arrive. It is moving through summer, after much of the runoff opportunity has already passed. The water that could have reversed the decline was supposed to come earlier. Much of it did not. At the same time, releases through Glen Canyon Dam were still running at several thousand cubic feet per second because the river does not end at the concrete wall. Water leaving Powell supports, flows through the Grand Canyon, enters Lake Mead, and contributes to a system serving farms, tribal nations, towns, industries, wildlife, and major metropolitan areas far downstream. The dam cannot simply close its gates until the reservoir looks healthier. This is where the dashboard becomes more than a collection of low numbers. Inflow is one line, release is another. When the second line stays above the first for long enough, storage becomes the account that pays the difference. During one provisional July reading, inflow was barely above 1,000 cubic feet per second, while total releases were close to 8,000. Those figures can change sharply from day to day, and federal data are revised, but the operational meaning is clear. On that day, far more water was leaving the reservoir than entering it. The surface was not merely low, it was still moving downward. Earlier in the year, the Bureau of Reclamation had already reported that the most probable unregulated inflow for water year 2026 could be only about 1/3 of the historical average. Under a lower inflow scenario, the volume was projected near 3 million acre-feet. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land, 1 foot deep, roughly 326,000 gallons. 3 million acre-feet sounds enormous until it is placed beside the scale of the system and the volumes expected in an average year. The abnormal pattern is not that no water is arriving. It is that the river is delivering only a fraction of the supply around which the reservoir was designed and the operating rules were written. By late spring, Reclamation was no longer treating the risk as a distant modeling exercise. Federal officials activated drought response operations intended to reduce the chance of Lake Powell falling below critical elevations. These actions can include changing operations at upstream reservoirs, adjusting the timing of releases, and moving water through the basin in ways that protect the elevation at Powell. But every protective action has a location from which the water must come. Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo Reservoir are not emergency tanks disconnected from communities and ecosystems. They are working reservoirs with their own users, power generation, recreation, environmental requirements, and future risks. Moving water from one location to defend another does not create new supply. It redistributes the remaining margin. On their own, the low inflow, falling elevation, drought response plan, and reduced power output could be treated as separate water management problems. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The upper basin is producing less runoff than expected. Lake Powell is losing stored water after the main snowmelt period. Operators must continue releasing water, and the physical distance between the reservoir surface and the hydropower threshold is becoming small enough to measure not in generations or decades, but in a few dozen vertical feet. That distance matters because Glen Canyon Dam changes character as the lake descends. At higher elevations, Water enters the hydropower intake structures with enough pressure to pass efficiently through the turbines. The spinning turbines generate electricity, but they also provide a controlled route for moving water downstream. As the surface falls, the pressure created by the weight and height of the water decreases. Generation becomes less efficient. Maximum power capacity declines. Eventually, the turbines can no longer perform normally. Federal agencies identify approximately 3,490 feet as minimum power pool, although actual operating limits can depend on equipment conditions and engineering decisions. Below that point, the system does not become an empty canyon overnight. Water remains behind the dam, but the preferred pathway begins to disappear. That distinction is easy to miss on a public reservoir map. The map shows a blue surface contracting against pale canyon walls. The operating room sees hydraulic head, intake elevations, turbine limits, release capacity, outlet restrictions, downstream requirements, and the number of feet left before one set of machinery must surrender its role to another. The first system visibly pulled into the decline is hydropower. Glen Canyon Dam was built with 8 generating units and has historically provided electricity that can be adjusted as demand changes. Hydropower can respond quickly compared with many thermal power plants. That flexibility helps grid operators balance supply and demand when solar generation drops in the evening, when temperatures drive air conditioning use upward, or when another generator unexpectedly goes offline. As Lake Powell falls, the dam does not need to reach minimum power pool before the power system feels the loss. Lower water pressure can reduce the amount of electricity produced from the same flow. Operators may have less capacity available during high demand. Replacement electricity must come from somewhere else, sometimes at a higher cost, and sometimes from sources that cannot respond as quickly. But the power system is only the first warning light. The second is water delivery. The turbines are not merely generators attached to the river. They are major passageways through the dam. If those passageways become unavailable, operators must rely more heavily on the river outlet works, a set of lower pipes and valves designed to release water beneath the hydropower intakes. These outlets can move water, but they were not intended to replace the turbines indefinitely under every possible low reservoir condition. Their capacity changes with reservoir elevation. Their operation can involve vibration, cavitation, air entrainment, wear, and maintenance questions that become more serious when a backup pathway is asked to become the primary pathway. The third warning light is the system below the dam. Flow through the Grand Canyon affects river temperature, beaches, sediment, aquatic habitat, recreation, and the timing of water entering Lake Mead. A change at Powell does not remain at Powell. It moves downstream hour by hour. The fourth warning light is political and institutional. The Colorado River is governed through compacts, laws, treaties, court decisions, contracts, environmental requirements, and temporary operating agreements. Many of those arrangements distribute water on paper. The dam must distribute it through machinery. When physical capacity narrows, legal promises encounter engineering limits. That is why this day is abnormal. The crisis is not defined by a single dramatic shutdown. It is defined by several systems beginning to lose flexibility at the same time. The reservoir has less stored water. The runoff season has delivered far less than normal. The dam has less hydraulic head. The power grid has less dispatchable hydropower. Upstream reservoirs are being considered as protection for Powell. Downstream users still depend on releases. And federal agencies are preparing for elevations that once belonged to contingency documents rather than routine operations. The public sees a drought map. The operations room sees a countdown measured in water, pressure, equipment, and choices. But even that is not the strangest part. The most important number on the dashboard may not be the elevation displayed today. It may be the speed at which the system is consuming the remaining distance, and how little seasonal opportunity remains to replace it before the next major demand period begins. The number dominating the Lake Powell story is 3,490 feet above sea level. It sounds like a measurement for engineers, surveyors, and reservoir maps. In reality, it is a boundary between two different versions of Glen Canyon Dam. Above that elevation, water can normally enter the hydropower intakes, descend through massive steel penstocks, spin 8 turbines, generate electricity, and continue downstream through a pathway designed to perform several jobs at once. Near or below that elevation, normal hydropower production becomes increasingly difficult and may stop. The river must then depend on lower outlet structures with different capacities, operating histories, and limitations. 3,490 feet is therefore not merely the point where electricity becomes uncertain. It is the point where the machinery carrying the Colorado River begins to change. To understand why that number is so disturbing, begin higher. Lake Powell is considered full at approximately 3,700 feet above sea level. Minimum power pool sits about 210 vertical feet below that mark. 210 feet is roughly 64 meters, close to the height of a 20-story building. That may sound like an enormous cushion, but most of it has already disappeared. Federal operators have spent recent years watching the reservoir occupy the lowest portion of that range, where every additional foot carries more operational meaning than it did near full pool. At approximately 3,525 feet, the Bureau of Reclamation identifies a target elevation intended to provide a 35-foot buffer above minimum power pool. 35 feet is about 10.5 meters. It is less than the height of many utility poles. In a reservoir stretching through long desert canyons, 35 vertical feet can contain a substantial volume of water. Operationally, however, it is a narrow band between a working power plant and a condition in which the main release pathway may be lost. The number is not just elevation, it is remaining room for error. Federal forecasts during the worsening 2026 runoff season showed how quickly that room could be consumed. The Bureau of Reclamation reported that the most probable unregulated inflow for the water year was projected near 3.27 million acre-feet, about 1/3 of the historical average. Under a drier probable minimum scenario, the forecast moved close to 3 million acre-feet. Earlier projections became severe enough for Reclamation to warn that Lake Powell could fall below minimum power pool without major intervention. Those figures require translation. 1 acre-foot equals roughly 326,000 gallons, enough water to cover an acre of land 1 foot deep. 3.27 million acre-feet therefore represents more than 1 trillion gallons. That sounds almost impossible to call small, but the Colorado River system operates at a scale where 1 trillion gallons can still represent a deeply deficient year. The long-term average unregulated inflow into Lake Powell is approximately 9.6 million acre-feet under the federal comparison period currently used for operations. A forecast of 3.27 million is not a minor shortfall. It is a missing volume of more than 6 million acre-feet compared with that average. That gap is close to 2 trillion gallons. More important, it is water that does not arrive to replace releases, evaporation, seepage, and demands elsewhere in the system. The headline number is therefore not a lake level floating alone in space. It is the physical result of a balance sheet. Water enters, water leaves. The difference changes storage. Storage changes elevation. Elevation changes pressure. Pressure changes power production and release capacity. Every line leads to the next. This is why a decline of 1 foot cannot be understood as though someone lowered the water in a swimming pool by 12 inches. Lake Powell does not have vertical walls or a uniform shape. Its shoreline spreads through branching canyons, bays, shelves, and steep rock faces. The amount of water represented by 1 vertical foot varies with elevation because the surface area and shape of the reservoir change. A foot near one elevation may represent a different volume than a foot somewhere else. Yet the engineering consequence still follows the surface downward. As the lake drops, the vertical distance between the water surface and the turbines decreases. That distance creates hydraulic head, the pressure that drives water through the generating units. Less head means each unit of water carries less potential energy into the turbines. The dam can produce less electricity before it reaches the formal minimum power pool threshold. In other words, the power failure does not suddenly begin at 3,490 feet. It develops on the way there. The system loses capability in stages. At full reservoir conditions, Glen Canyon Dam has a maximum physical generating capacity of more than 1,300 megawatts. That number describes an upper engineering capability, not constant output. Actual generation changes with water releases, reservoir elevation, maintenance, environmental operations, and electricity demand. As the reservoir falls, maximum available capacity also falls. The same water passing through the dam can produce less power because it begins its descent from a lower point. The headline is a reservoir approaching a threshold. The real story is a power plant being gradually derated before the public sees a shutdown. That loss appears outside the canyon in ways that are difficult to photograph. Hydropower from Glen Canyon can be dispatched relatively quickly, meaning operators can raise or lower generation as grid conditions change. This flexibility is especially valuable during rapid transitions, such as the evening period when solar power declines, while households continue using air conditioning, lighting, appliances, and industrial equipment. Losing part of that flexible output does not automatically cause a blackout. Other generators, power purchases, batteries, transmission resources, conservation measures, and market operations can compensate. But compensation has a cost. It may require more expensive electricity. It may increase reliance on fossil fuel generation. It may consume reserve capacity that the grid would otherwise use during another emergency. A falling reservoir, therefore, converts water scarcity into a narrower electrical safety margin long before homes lose power. There is another number below minimum power pool that shows why hydropower cannot be treated as the final failure. At approximately 3,370 feet lies dead pool. That phrase can sound like the reservoir has become completely empty. It has not. Dead pool is the elevation near which Glen Canyon Dam may no longer be able to release more water than the amount flowing into the reservoir through its existing outlet configuration. About 120 vertical feet separate minimum power pool from dead pool. That is roughly 37 meters. The distance is larger than the 35-foot protective buffer above minimum power pool, but it is not an unlimited second reservoir. Inside that band, the dam would depend on lower river outlet works, rather than the hydropower turbines for controlled releases. As elevation falls, the pressure driving water through those lower outlets also declines. Their discharge capacity falls with it. The system can move progressively closer to a condition in which downstream release is governed less by policy and more by physics. That is the deeper meaning of the elevation number. At high water, managers decide how much water to release within legal, environmental, and operational rules. At very low water, the dam itself begins limiting what decisions remain possible. 3,490 feet is unusual, not simply because the reservoir has rarely approached it since filling. It is unusual because the Colorado River's operating framework was built around the assumption that Lake Powell would provide storage large enough to absorb dry years, support upper basin obligations, generate power, and regulate deliveries downstream. A reservoir near minimum power pool is no longer performing those functions with the same margin. It is closer to becoming a narrow passage through which operators must move a legally contested and physically diminished river. The number is not just water depth. It is time being removed from the decision process. At higher storage, managers can use the reservoir to shift water between wet months and dry months, and between wet years and dry years. At lower storage, that ability contracts. A poor snow season reaches the dam sooner. A forecasting error becomes harder to absorb. A required release consumes a larger share of what remains. An unexpected equipment problem becomes more consequential because fewer alternative pathways are available. This is how the number appears in real life. It appears as less electricity from each acre-foot of water. It appears as emergency transfers from upstream reservoirs. It appears as negotiations over whether releases can be reduced. It appears as maintenance crews evaluating machinery that may soon be used in unfamiliar ways. It appears as power agencies purchasing replacement energy and water managers defending smaller buffers. It appears as a river system, losing the luxury of separating one problem from another, but elevation still does not tell the entire story. A lake can sit above a threshold and remain in danger if it is descending rapidly. It can stand lower and become temporarily safer if inflow has begun exceeding releases. The visible number tells us where Lake Powell is. The hidden number tells us where it is moving, how quickly it is getting there, and whether the basin still has enough time to reverse the direction. The visible number tells us how many feet remain above minimum power pool. The hidden number tells us how quickly those feet can disappear and whether the river has enough time to replace them. That difference changes everything. A reservoir elevation is a photograph. The water balance is the motion inside the photograph. Lake Powell can stand above 3,490 feet on a federal chart and still be moving toward danger if releases, evaporation, and other losses continue exceeding the water arriving from upstream. It can also sit at a lower elevation and become temporarily more stable if inflow begins exceeding outflow. Where the lake is matters, but direction, speed, and recovery time determine what happens next. This is why the most important calculation inside the operations room is not simply feet above a threshold. It is net depletion over time. The calculation begins with inflow. Water reaches Lake Powell from the Colorado River, the San Juan River, and smaller tributaries after precipitation falls across the upper basin. Much of the annual supply begins as mountain snow. During spring, that snow melts, enters soil, moves into streams, and eventually reaches the reservoir. Releases through Glen Canyon Dam then move water downstream toward Lake Mead. Evaporation removes another share. The balance between those additions and losses determines whether the reservoir rises or falls. But that balance is not constant throughout the year. Timing is the hidden mechanism inside the hidden number. A weak inflow forecast in January still contains several months of uncertainty. More snow may fall. Spring storms may improve conditions. Temperatures may slow or accelerate melting. Soil moisture may change how much runoff reaches the river. A weak forecast after the main runoff season is different. By then, much of the basin's largest opportunity to refill the reservoir has already passed. The same missing acre-foot becomes more dangerous because there is less calendar left in which to replace it. The headline is how much water failed to arrive. The real story is when the failure became clear. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, the May 24-month study used a most probable water year inflow forecast of approximately 3.27 million acre-feet, about 34% of the 1991 through 2020 average. That forecast placed Lake Powell near 3,511 feet at the end of water year 2026, after federal operational changes were included. The elevation remained above minimum power pool in that most probable projection, but the improvement did not mean the underlying drought signal had vanished. The modeled result included a reduction in the annual release from Lake Powell and drought response water sent from Flaming Gorge Reservoir. In other words, the projected buffer was not produced by runoff alone. It depended on intervention. This is the abnormal detail. The system did not simply receive enough water to move away from danger. Managers changed how water was distributed through space and time to defend a critical elevation. The Bureau of Reclamation reduced the planned annual release from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet. At the same time, the 2026 Drought Response Operations Plan called for roughly 660,000 to 1 million acre-feet of additional water to be released from Flaming Gorge and moved toward Lake Powell by April of 2020. 7. Those actions can delay or avoid a drop below minimum power pool, but they also reveal the hidden arithmetic. If a smaller release from Powell and a large transfer from an upstream reservoir are required to preserve only a few additional feet of operating margin, then those feet are not passive water storage. They are actively defended infrastructure. This is not just a hydropower failure. This is a river delivery system losing its operating margin. The phrase operating margin means the space between what the system is being asked to do and what it can still safely do. On an electrical grid, that margin may be spare generating capacity. In a hospital, it may be available beds and staff. At Lake Powell, it includes water elevation, hydraulic pressure, outlet capacity, stored volume, forecast confidence, and time before the next major decision. As the reservoir falls, those margins contract together. The dam produces less power. Operators have fewer release pathways. Upstream reservoirs surrender part of their own storage. Downstream releases become harder to maintain without further depletion. Forecast errors become more expensive. A dry month that might once have been absorbed inside a large reservoir now reaches operational decisions much faster. The hidden number, therefore, has 4 parts. The first is the difference between inflow and release. The second is the duration of that difference. The third is the seasonal opportunity remaining for recovery. The fourth is the amount of outside intervention needed to prevent the threshold from being crossed. Remove any one of those parts, and the risk can appear smaller than it is. Consider the first part. If Lake Powell receives 3,000 cubic feet per second, while the dam releases 8,000, the reservoir is losing water at a net rate near 5,000 cubic feet per second before evaporation and other factors are considered. The exact daily measurements change, and short snapshots should never be mistaken for annual totals. But the example shows why the surface can keep descending even while a substantial river is flowing into the lake. Water entering the reservoir does not automatically mean storage is increasing. The outflow matters more than the eye can see. Now consider duration. A one-day imbalance may barely affect operations. A similar imbalance repeated for weeks becomes a measurable decline. Repeated for months, it can consume an entire protective buffer. The danger is not only the size of the deficit, it is the deficit multiplied by time. That is how a gradual decline becomes an infrastructure event without a single dramatic moment. No wall of water arrives, no gate suddenly breaks. The reservoir simply spends more days paying out more water than the basin deposits. Then comes recovery. Lake Powell does not receive its supply evenly across 12 months. The largest pulse normally arrives during spring runoff. Once that pulse weakens and passes, summer thunderstorms may create local floods without delivering enough basin-wide volume to rebuild major reservoir storage. Autumn and winter can bring valuable precipitation, but much of it is stored temporarily as mountain snow rather than immediately becoming reservoir inflow. The system may therefore wait months for the next serious refill opportunity. During that interval, releases and evaporation continue. A low elevation in late summer carries a different meaning from the same elevation before a strong spring runoff. The map may show the same blue line. The calendar does not. The final hidden component is intervention dependency. Federal operators estimate that the 2026 drought response releases and adjustments could raise Lake Powell by many feet compared with a no-action scenario. That is a meaningful protection. It is also borrowed resilience. Water released from Flaming Gorge cannot remain stored there for its own future droughts, power production, recreation, and environmental needs. A reduced release from Glen Canyon protects Powell, but changes the amount and timing of water moving toward Lake Mead. Each action creates breathing room in one part of the basin by using flexibility somewhere else. It does not manufacture runoff. This is why a forecast showing Lake Powell above minimum power pool after intervention must not be read as proof that the danger has ended. It shows that operators may still have tools. The hidden question is how often those tools can be used, how much water they can move, and what happens when several reservoirs need protection at the same time. A system can survive a bad year by spending stored water. It can survive another by changing releases. It can survive another by borrowing from upstream, but every response consumes a different kind of margin. Eventually, the problem is no longer whether managers know what to do. It is whether enough physical flexibility remains to do it. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. It is the rate of decline, the timing of the runoff failure, the length of the recovery window, and the volume of intervention required to keep the machinery working. And once those numbers are placed together, the next question becomes unavoidable. What physical process turns a shrinking water balance into less power, weaker release capacity, and a dam operating closer to the limits of its own design? The mechanism begins high above Lake Powell, long before the falling reservoir becomes visible against the canyon walls. It begins as snow accumulating across the upper Colorado River basin, then continues through temperature, soil, tributaries, storage, pressure, machinery, and finally the human systems that depend on the dam. By the time the public sees a lower boat ramp or a wider band of pale rock, the river system has already carried the stress through several hidden stages. The first stage is precipitation. Much of the water entering Lake Powell begins as winter snow in the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. That snowpack functions like a delayed reservoir. It stores water during cold months, then releases it gradually as temperatures rise. But the amount of snow on the ground is not the same as the amount of water that will reach the reservoir. Snow water equivalent measures how much liquid water is contained in the snowpack. Even that number does not guarantee runoff. The water must still survive the journey from mountain to river. It must melt at a rate the landscape can transmit. It must move across or through soil. It must avoid being consumed by dry vegetation, absorbed by depleted ground, or return to the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. This is where a normal-looking snow map can produce an abnormal river. After prolonged drought and warm conditions, upper basin soils can begin the runoff season unusually dry. The first meltwater does not immediately rush into streams. It disappears into the ground. Plants use more of it. Warmer air increases evaporative demand, meaning the atmosphere can pull more moisture from soil, snow, and vegetation. The basin may receive snow, yet the river receives a smaller share of what fell. The mechanism is called runoff efficiency. In simple terms, it asks how much precipitation becomes stream flow. When runoff efficiency declines, the same snowpack can produce less water at Lake Powell than historical relationships would suggest. The forecast shows snow. The reservoir receives what survives the landscape. That is the first hidden transfer of loss. The second stage is timing. Snow that melts too early can create a pulse before operators and ecosystems would normally expect it. Snow that disappears during an unusually warm period may move rapidly, but dry soil and thirsty vegetation can capture a large share. A fast melt can also shorten the runoff season. Instead of a long, sustained flow that supports weeks of reservoir recovery, the system receives a smaller pulse, followed by an early decline. The total volume matters, but so does the shape of the hydrograph, the curve showing river flow over time. A broad spring rise gives managers time and water. A narrow pulse can arrive, peak, and disappear before storage has rebuilt enough operating margin. The river is not only delivering less, it may be delivering it at the wrong time. From the mountains, the surviving runoff enters tributaries. The Green River, the Colorado River, the San Juan River, and many smaller channels carry water toward Lake Powell. Along the way, some water is diverted for farms, towns, industry, and tribal communities. Some is stored in upstream reservoirs. Some evaporates. Some supports wetlands and riparian ecosystems. None of these uses is an accident or a theft from an otherwise untouched river. They are part of the operating system that has developed across the basin. But in a low runoff year, every diversion and every loss represents a larger percentage of the total flow. When the river is abundant, multiple demands can be met with room remaining. When the river is diminished, the same demands press more directly against one another. Then the water reaches Lake Powell, where the mechanism changes from basin hydrology to reservoir physics. A reservoir stores volume, but the dam responds to elevation. These are related, though not interchangeable. Lake Powell spreads through a complex network of canyons. As storage declines, the water surface retreats both downward and horizontally. The exposed bathtub ring makes the loss visible, but the critical engineering change occurs vertically. The distance between the reservoir surface and the water exiting below the dam creates hydraulic head. Hydraulic head is stored gravitational energy. Water high behind the dam has the potential to fall. When operators open a path through a penstock, gravity accelerates the water downward. The greater the vertical distance, the more pressure and energy are available. Imagine two water tanks connected to identical pipes. One tank is placed on the roof of a tall building. The other sits only one floor above the outlet. Water from the higher tank exits with more pressure because gravity has a greater distance through which to act. Glen Canyon Dam follows the same principle at a much larger scale. The reservoir is the elevated tank. The penstocks are enormous pipes. The turbines convert the moving water into mechanical rotation. Generators convert that rotation into electricity. At higher reservoir elevations, each unit of water can do more work as it falls. As the surface declines, that same unit of water enters with less pressure and carries less potential energy. The power loss is therefore gradual. A turbine does not wait until the reservoir reaches one precise line and then instantly fail. Its operating conditions deteriorate as hydraulic head falls. Maximum output declines. Efficiency changes. The range in which operators can safely and reliably run the machines narrows. Cavitation risk can increase under unfavorable conditions. Cavitation occurs when local pressure in flowing water drops enough for vapor bubbles to form. Those bubbles can collapse against metal surfaces with intense force, producing vibration, noise, pitting, and damage. It is not unique to Glen Canyon Dam, and it does not mean destruction is inevitable. It is an engineering condition. Operators monitor because turbines are designed for particular combinations of flow, pressure, and rotational speed. As the reservoir moves outside familiar ranges, safe operation may require restrictions. The mechanism is now moving from water shortage into mechanical limitation. Less runoff creates lower storage. Lower storage creates lower elevation. Lower elevation creates less hydraulic head. Less head creates less power and a narrower turbine operating range. But the mechanism does not stop when electricity stops. This is the central misunderstanding. The turbines are also passageways for the river. Water enters through intake structures in the upstream face of the dam, descends through large penstocks, passes through the turbines, and exits downstream. When the turbines cannot operate normally, operators must use another route. Glen Canyon Dam has river outlet works positioned below the hydropower intakes. These are large pipes, controlled by valves that can release water without producing electricity. They were designed to provide operational flexibility, including the ability to pass water when generating units are unavailable. But a backup route is not automatically equivalent to the primary route. The river outlet works have different hydraulic behavior, capacity, maintenance requirements, and operating history. Water moving at high speed through a pipe can create complex pressure changes. If flow separates from the pipe surface, or if pressure falls too low, cavitation can occur. Air may need to be introduced to stabilize the flow and reduce damage. Valves must control enormous forces. Vibration must remain within acceptable limits. Surfaces exposed to high-velocity water can erode. These systems can be operated safely, but safe operation depends on inspection, maintenance, engineering analysis, and the reservoir elevation that supplies pressure. Here lies the second major reversal. As Lake Powell falls below the hydropower range, the river outlet works become more important. Yet the same falling water level that makes them more important also reduces the hydraulic head available to push water through them. At first, the lower outlets may be able to carry required releases. As elevation continues falling, their maximum discharge capacity declines. The system is being asked to rely more heavily on a pathway whose capability is also shrinking. The visible problem is losing the turbines. The deeper problem is that gravity is weakening every available route through the dam. This is why dead pool matters. Near dead pool, the reservoir surface becomes so low relative to the outlets that the dam may no longer be able to release water at a rate substantially greater than inflow. The phrase does not mean every drop is trapped or that the reservoir has vanished. It means control begins transferring from human scheduling to physical geometry. Above that condition, Operators can generally decide among a range of release rates. Near it, the difference in elevation may no longer generate enough pressure to move the desired volume through existing outlets. The dam still stands. The reservoir still contains water, but the system has lost much of its ability to command the river. The mechanism then moves downstream. Water, released through the turbines or outlet works, enters the Colorado River below Glen Canyon Dam. The amount, timing, temperature, and pattern of those releases shape conditions through the Grand Canyon. Glen Canyon Dam has altered the natural river for decades, storing warm surface water while releasing colder water from deeper levels. Reservoir elevation can change the depth and temperature of water entering different structures. Lower levels may affect downstream thermal conditions, which matter for native fish, aquatic insects, algae, and the food web. Changes in release timing can affect beaches, sediment movement, recreational boating, and habitat. A mechanical decision at the dam becomes an ecological condition many miles away. Continue downstream, and the same water eventually reaches Lake Mead. Powell and Mead function as connected storage systems. Powell helps regulate flows from the upper basin. Mead supports major lower basin deliveries and hydropower at Hoover Dam. When less water leaves Powell, Mead receives less inflow unless other sources compensate. When more water leaves Powell to support Mead, Powell declines faster. The two reservoirs can redistribute shortage through time, but they cannot erase it. Protecting one can intensify pressure on the other. This is not evidence of failure by itself. It is the purpose of coordinated reservoir operations. The danger emerges when both reservoirs begin with low storage, and the river cannot provide enough water to rebuild either one. Then coordination becomes the management of scarcity rather than the sharing of abundance. The mechanism also enters the electrical grid. When water passes through Glen Canyon turbines, it produces hydropower that can change output relatively quickly. Grid operators value that flexibility because electricity supply and demand must remain balanced almost instantaneously. Solar farms may produce strongly at midday and decline rapidly in the evening. Wind generation can rise or fall with weather. Thermal power plants may take longer to change output. Hydropower can help fill those gaps. As hydraulic head falls, Glen Canyon provides less energy from the same release and less maximum capacity when the grid needs a rapid response. Replacement power may come from natural gas plants, energy markets, batteries, other hydropower facilities, or demand reduction. None of those responses guarantees failure, but each uses money, fuel, transmission capacity, storage, or reserves that could have served another need. The loss of hydropower, therefore, propagates beyond the customer's directly assigned federal power. It changes the options available to the wider grid. The mechanism moves through finance as well. Revenue from hydropower supports parts of the Colorado River Storage Project, including operations, maintenance, and environmental programs. When generation falls, less electricity is available for sale. Replacement power can become more expensive. Rates may rise. Budgets may tighten. Maintenance still has to occur, especially when low reservoir conditions place unusual demands on outlet structures. A physical decline in water pressure can therefore become a funding problem for the system responsible for managing the decline. This is how risk compounds. The first shortage reduces power. Reduced power reduces revenue. Lower revenue arrives at the same time the infrastructure may require more analysis, modification, and maintenance. The event is visible outside. The load accumulates inside. There is also a feedback through upstream reservoirs. To protect Lake Powell, managers can release additional water from Flaming Gorge and other Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs. That water travels downstream and raises Powell relative to what would have occurred without intervention. But the transfer lowers storage upstream. Flaming Gorge also generates hydropower. It supports recreation, communities, fisheries, and environmental flows. The mechanism has now moved in reverse through the basin. A low snow year reduces inflow to Powell. Protecting Powell draws water from an upstream reservoir. The upstream reservoir loses elevation and future flexibility. One dam's safety margin is increased by spending another dam's margin. Again, this can be a rational and necessary response. The important point is that it is not free water, it is a relocation of risk. By the time the mechanism reaches people, it no longer looks like snow or hydraulic head. It looks like a power purchase made at a higher price. It looks like a marina moving farther from the shoreline. It looks like a tribal water project waiting on infrastructure while the basin renegotiates scarcity. It looks like a farmer receiving a different allocation or facing uncertainty about the next season. It looks like a maintenance crew preparing outlet pipes that may be used more heavily than previous generations expected. It looks like a city manager asking whether an intake remains usable. It looks like a family hearing that the lights will probably stay on while quietly paying more to keep them on. The body does not experience reservoir decline as an elevation chart. It experiences the decisions made because the chart is falling. This is the complete pathway, from warm air into snow loss, from snow loss into reduced runoff, from reduced runoff into storage depletion, from storage depletion into lower hydraulic head, from lower head into weaker turbines and smaller outlet capacity, from the dam into the grid, the Grand Canyon, Lake Mead, budgets, farms, and households. By the time one generator is finally switched off, the system has already been carrying the drought through soil, steel, contracts, ecosystems, and human choices for months or years. But a mechanism remains abstract until it enters one specific life. The next question is not what low water does to a reservoir in theory. It is what happens when that shrinking operating margin reaches one worker, one household, one decision, and one day that can no longer unfold as planned. To see how Lake Powell's decline reaches a human life, follow a single ordinary chain of decisions in northern Arizona. Imagine a maintenance electrician living near Page, not as a named individual with a fabricated biography, but as a representative of thousands of workers whose daily routines depend on systems tied to the reservoir. He wakes before sunrise in a small house cooled through the night by an aging air conditioner. His partner works at a school. Their household budget is predictable only when electricity, fuel, groceries, and housing costs remain within a familiar range. On the wall, Lake Powell is still a place on a calendar photograph, a blue surface between red cliffs. In his workday, however, the reservoir is pressure, voltage, machinery, and risk. The mechanism outside begins with less snow becoming runoff. It enters the lake as missing water. The missing water lowers the reservoir surface. The lower surface reduces hydraulic head at Glen Canyon Dam. The reduced head lowers the amount of electricity that can be generated from each unit of water released downstream. That engineering sequence reaches his home first through something almost invisible. The power grid must replace what the dam can no longer provide. No alarm sounds in the kitchen. The lights do not necessarily flicker. Grid operators purchase electricity from another source, schedule different generating units, use battery storage, call on natural gas plants, or adjust transfers across transmission lines. The response can work. Most days, it does work. But the replacement may cost more, and it may not provide the same flexibility. Those costs pass through agencies, contracts, rates, and public budgets before they reach a monthly bill. The family does not experience climate stress as a line on a hydrograph. It experiences it as a smaller amount of money remaining after essential payments. A modest increase matters because it does not arrive alone. Hotter conditions can raise cooling demand. At the same time, hydropower output is declining. Fuel prices may change. Food costs may rise when agricultural producers face water shortages elsewhere in the basin. Insurance, rent, and transportation costs continue, regardless of the reservoir. Each increase may appear manageable on its own. Together, they narrow the household's operating margin in the same way falling water narrows the dams. The electrician may respond by delaying a vehicle repair, reducing cooling during the afternoon, taking an extra shift, or postponing a medical appointment with a deductible he cannot comfortably pay. None of those choices will appear in a federal reservoir report, yet they are part of the pathway. A missing acre-foot becomes a lower water level. A lower water level becomes less electricity. Less electricity becomes a replacement purchase. the purchase becomes a higher cost. The higher cost becomes a decision made inside one kitchen. But that is only the first route through the household. The second comes through employment. Page and surrounding communities have economies connected to the dam, recreation, tourism, public land, power operations, transportation, and water infrastructure. A falling reservoir changes how visitors reach marinas and boat ramps. It can force facilities to move, close, or invest in longer access routes. Businesses that depend on boat traffic may face shorter seasons or higher operating costs. Workers may lose hours even if the reservoir never reaches minimum power pool. The visible event is a lower shoreline. The human event is a schedule posted with fewer shifts. For a household living close to the edge of its budget, losing one day of work each week can be more immediate than losing a distant block of generating capacity. The third route is drinking water. Page and the nearby Lecce community depend on infrastructure connected to Lake Powell. As the reservoir fell during the earlier drought emergency, federal agencies completed a lower water intake connection, intended to maintain access if the lake approached dead pool. That project demonstrated an important truth. Water remaining in a reservoir is not automatically water a community can use. It must be reachable through an intake. It must enter a pipe. Pumps must overcome elevation and friction. Treatment facilities must operate. Electricity must remain available. Distribution pressure must be maintained. A city can stand beside billions of gallons and still face shortage if the hardware connecting the reservoir to homes is positioned above the water or cannot operate under new conditions. The family may turn a faucet and see normal flow, but that normality now depends on a deeper intake, working pumps, maintenance crews, spare parts, and the electricity required to lift and treat the water. Each component is small compared with the reservoir. Together, they determine whether water reaches the sink. This creates a dangerous overlap. Falling water can reduce hydropower, while increasing the energy needed to move water from lower elevations. The system may have less local electricity available at the same time. Pumping becomes more demanding. A deeper lift generally requires more energy. Treatment challenges may also change as water quality, temperature, sediment, and biological conditions shift with reservoir elevation. The problem is not that every low reservoir automatically produces unsafe drinking water. The problem is that maintaining ordinary service requires more adaptation, more equipment, and more money. The event outside becomes work inside the utility. Now place the electrician at the dam or at an associated facility. His day begins with procedures, readings, and inspections. At normal elevations, familiar equipment carries the river through pathways operators have used for decades. As conditions move toward minimum power pool, the task changes. Crews must evaluate turbine limits. Engineers must consider vibration, cavitation, pressure, flow, and safe operating ranges. Maintenance schedules become more consequential because taking one component offline may remove capacity the system cannot easily replace. If river outlet works must carry a greater share of releases, workers may inspect valves, coatings, piping, air systems, sensors, and structural behavior under conditions that are less routine. The risk does not arrive as cinematic disaster. It arrives as a larger number of decisions for which mistakes carry greater consequences. One reading outside its expected range may require consultation. One unusual sound may trigger an inspection. One unavailable replacement part may delay work. The smaller the operating margin, the less room the crew has to absorb uncertainty. This affects the body. Long shifts reduce sleep. Heat exposure increases fatigue. Complex maintenance under pressure increases cognitive load. Workers responsible for critical infrastructure often operate under procedures designed to control risk, but procedures do not remove the physical effects of stress. The body receives the reservoir decline as vigilance. It receives it as a night call, an extended shift, protective equipment in hot conditions, or the knowledge that a valve normally treated as secondary may soon carry a central role. The damage begins inside before anything breaks outside. The same water shortage moves through another person hundreds of miles downstream. Imagine a farm worker in central Arizona or southern California beginning a shift before the desert heat peaks. The farm may receive Colorado River water through canals, pumping stations, contracts, and district allocations. Whether a particular field faces a cut depends on legal priority, location, crop, district decisions, conservation agreements, and the conditions of the year. It would be false to claim that one falling season at Lake Powell directly dries one named field. The pathway is more complex, but system scarcity changes the decisions surrounding that field. Water districts plan with less certainty. Growers may fallow acreage, change crops, invest in irrigation technology, lease water, or absorb higher costs. A farmer with fewer planted acres hires fewer workers. A packing operation handles less produce. A truck carries fewer loads. The worker experiences the basin shortage as fewer paid days, not as a compact negotiation. Drought enters the soil. From the soil, it enters the crop plan. From the crop plan, it enters employment. From employment, it enters rent, food, and health. That is the human pathway. The mechanism does not stop at people who live near the river. Electricity from the Colorado River Storage Project has historically been marketed to municipalities, cooperatives, irrigation districts, tribal utilities, and public agencies across several western states. When generation declines, customers may face higher costs for replacement power. Some large systems can spread those costs across many users. Smaller utilities may have less flexibility. An irrigation district may need electricity to pump water across elevation. A tribal utility may serve dispersed households over long distances. A rural cooperative may maintain extensive infrastructure with a limited customer base. The same reduction in hydropower can therefore create different burdens depending on who receives the bill and how much financial margin that institution already has. A wealthy household may barely notice. A low-income family may reduce cooling during dangerous heat. A large city may purchase replacement energy. A small public utility may delay another capital project. The physical loss is shared. The vulnerability is not. That difference matters because the Colorado River Basin is not socially uniform. Tribal nations hold significant water rights, including rights that remain undeveloped because infrastructure has not been fully funded or completed. Some communities near major reservoirs and pipelines still lack reliable household water service. Agricultural workers may have little control over planting decisions that determine their income. Renters cannot replace inefficient cooling systems. Elderly residents may depend on electrically powered medical equipment. A general statement that millions of people rely on the Colorado River conceals these unequal pathways. The first person harmed is not always the person using the most water. It may be the person with the fewest alternatives when prices rise, work disappears, or a local system requires emergency repair. Consider the family's school day. If public energy or water costs rise, municipal and school budgets must absorb them. That may mean less money for maintenance, staffing, cooling upgrades, or transportation. Again, no single reservoir decline automatically closes a classroom, but repeated system costs accumulate. A school built for an older climate may already need more air conditioning. A town facing lower tourism revenue may collect less local tax. A water utility may need new pumps or intake work. A power customer may pay more for replacement energy. Public institutions are then asked to provide more protection with less financial room. The reservoir's lost operating margin becomes the community's lost budget margin. There is also a psychological pathway. People living near a shrinking reservoir see change in a way that distant customers do not. Roads that once ended near water now stop above dry sediment. Boat ramps extend toward shorelines that keep retreating. Old canyon features reappear. Infrastructure, built for a higher lake, stands stranded. Each image can be interpreted differently. Some see drought. Some see water policy failure. Some see an over-allocated river. Some see a temporary cycle. Some see the recovery of a landscape submerged by the dam. The evidence does not require everyone to share one emotional response, but uncertainty itself creates stress. Workers, business owners, Farmers and families must make decisions before they know whether the next winter will bring recovery or another deficit. Should a marina invest in new access? Should a household remain in the region? Should a farmer plant a permanent crop requiring water for decades? Should a utility borrow money for infrastructure designed around projections that may change again? The body experiences uncertainty as hesitation, and hesitation can become economic loss. The event is visible outside. The decision pressure moves inside, yet the story must not imply that everyone connected to Lake Powell is already in crisis. Federal interventions may keep the reservoir above minimum power pool. Utilities can purchase replacement electricity. Engineers can adapt outlet operations. Communities can deepen intakes. Farmers can conserve or change production. Agreements can reduce demand. These are real forms of resilience. The danger lies in how many adaptations are required at once and how long they must continue. Each adaptation has a cost, a limit, and a person responsible for making it work. The electrician keeps the equipment operating. The utility worker keeps water moving. The grid operator keeps frequency stable. The farmer changes a planting plan. The family changes its budget. The system does not fail because nobody responds. It becomes fragile when every layer must respond continuously just to preserve what used to be normal. At the end of the day, the representative worker returns home. The lights are on. Water comes from the faucet. The school will open tomorrow. Nothing appears to have collapsed. That appearance is important because functioning infrastructure can conceal the effort required to keep it functioning. Somewhere upstream, water may have been released from another reservoir. Somewhere in a control center, replacement power may have been purchased. Somewhere inside the dam, a crew may have inspected an outlet that could soon become more important. Somewhere in a budget, another project may have been delayed. The household experiences continuity. The system experiences load. And the most dangerous moment may come not when one family notices the reservoir decline, but when a small component, carrying all that hidden effort, no longer has enough margin left to compensate. The weak point is not the whole dam. The weak point is the smaller pathway that may be asked to carry the river after the main pathway can no longer do its job. At Glen Canyon Dam, that pathway is the river outlet works. 4 large bypass tubes positioned below the hydropower intakes. Under normal conditions, most controlled releases can pass through the power plant, producing electricity as the water moves downstream. The outlet works provide another route. They can release water without generating power, support special operations, and help move the river when turbines are unavailable. But a structure designed as an alternate pathway becomes a very different system when low reservoir elevation threatens to make it the only pathway. Each outlet consists of a pipe roughly 8 feet in diameter. Together, the 4 outlets have a rated capacity of about 15,000 cubic feet per second under favorable reservoir conditions. That sounds comfortably large. A flow of 15,000 cubic feet per second could fill an Olympic swimming pool in only a few seconds, but the number is not fixed under all elevations. Outlet capacity depends on hydraulic head, the pressure created by the height of water above the pipes. As Lake Powell falls, that pressure declines. Less pressure means less water can be pushed through the outlets. The same drought that increases dependence on the bypass tubes also reduces the force available to operate them. That is the engineering trap. The backup grows more important while becoming less capable. Below approximately 3,490 feet, federal officials say releases from Glen Canyon Dam would have to move through the river outlet works rather than the hydropower turbines. The loss of generation would be immediate and visible in power accounts. The deeper operational problem would be uncertainty about how the outlet system performs during extended use at unusually low elevations. These pipes have operated before. They have helped produce high-flow experiments and have passed water when generators were unavailable. But occasional use is not the same as carrying nearly the entire managed river for months or years. Duration changes the problem. A valve opened briefly can be inspected afterward. A valve required continuously becomes infrastructure that cannot easily be removed from service. A pipe used intermittently can wait for a maintenance window. A pipe carrying an essential downstream release may have no convenient window. The danger is not simply whether the outlets can open. It is whether they can remain reliable while the reservoir continues falling and the system has fewer alternatives each month. Water moving through a large outlet pipe carries enormous energy. It accelerates as pressure drives it toward the downstream side of the dam. At bends, valves, transitions, and areas where flow separates from a surface, local pressure can fall sharply. If it drops low enough, vapor bubbles form in the water. When those bubbles move into higher pressure and collapse, they can strike metal or concrete with repeated microscopic impacts. This process is called cavitation. One bubble is insignificant. Billions of collapsing bubbles over time can pit surfaces, create vibration, remove protective material, and damage a structure meant to control a powerful flow. Engineers manage cavitation through design, operating limits, aeration, inspection, coatings, repairs, and careful control of valves. The existence of cavitation risk does not mean an outlet is about to fail. It means extended operation must be treated as a mechanical load, not as a simple act of opening a pipe. The Bureau of Reclamation began relining all 4 river outlets in 2024, describing the work as necessary to support efficient and reliable water deliveries. The project was not evidence that collapse was imminent. It was evidence that the agency understood these components could become more important under low reservoir conditions. Relining protects surfaces exposed to high-velocity water and helps extend the useful life of the outlets. But maintenance creates its own operational puzzle. An outlet being repaired cannot carry its full share of the river. If several pathways are unavailable because of turbine limits, inspection, valve problems, or construction, the remaining outlets carry more responsibility. The weak point is therefore not only pipe strength, it is redundancy. Redundancy means having another component ready when one component is unavailable. At high reservoir elevation, Glen Canyon Dam has multiple turbines and 4 outlet tubes. Water can be distributed among them. At lower elevation, the turbines may be removed from the equation. 4 outlets become the complete set. If one must be closed, the system is reduced to 3. If another develops a problem, capacity narrows again. The river does not pause while crews search for a replacement part. Downstream obligations, ecosystem needs, drinking water systems, and Lake Mead continue waiting for flow. This is how a large dam can become vulnerable through a small count of components. 8 generating units become unavailable. 4 outlets inherit the work. 1 valve can then matter to an entire basin. The outlet works are not the only weak point. The control system around them matters too. Sensors measure pressure, vibration, temperature, valve position, and flow. Electrical systems move gates and valves. Communications allow operators to coordinate changes. Backup power supports essential controls. Air systems may help manage hydraulic conditions. Each component is small compared with the concrete dam, but failure rarely begins with the largest object in view. It begins with the instrument that gives a false reading, the actuator that does not travel as expected, the seal that begins leaking, the coating damaged by high-velocity water, or the spare part that requires months to manufacture. None of those failures is inevitable. Their importance increases because the system has fewer alternate pathways. The dam itself may remain structurally sound, while operational flexibility collapses around one unavailable component. The map shows a massive concrete arch. The system is failing at a valve, a pipe surface, or a maintenance window. Another weak point lies several miles away in the water system serving Page and Lechi. For years, the main municipal intake could draw from Lake Powell only while the reservoir remained above a certain elevation. A backup connection reached lower water by tapping into penstocks. When prolonged decline made both pathways vulnerable, federal agencies completed a third and deeper connection. That newest intake connects to 2 river outlet tubes and can reach water at approximately 3,362 feet. The project allows the communities to access Lake Powell, near or even slightly below the dam's commonly cited dead pool elevation. The achievement is real. It also reveals how narrow the chain can become. Drinking water for a community depends on access to 2 bypass tubes that may simultaneously be carrying the Colorado River through the dam. A structure serving basin-wide releases can also become part of a local municipal intake. Maintenance, pressure, water quality, pumping, and outlet operations begin intersecting in one piece of infrastructure. Water in the lake is not enough. The community needs the correct tube available, the connection open, pumps functioning, treatment operating, and electricity reaching every stage. This is a common feature of water crises. Scarcity is often described as the absence of water. Operationally, it is frequently the absence of accessible water at the correct elevation, pressure, quality, location, or time. Lake Powell could contain millions of acre-feet, while a high intake sits above the surface. A lower pipe solves that problem until the reservoir falls farther, or the pipe is unavailable. A pump solves the elevation problem until power fails, or a motor needs repair. Treatment solves the quality problem until changing source conditions exceed the plant's capabilities. Every solution reveals the next component in the chain. The weak point moves. At the power plant, another small component is the transformer and transmission connection that carries electricity away from the dam. Hydropower has value only if generators can send it into the grid. Low reservoir levels reduce generation, but grid instability can also emerge from the loss of the dam's flexibility rather than the loss of total annual energy alone. Glen Canyon generation can rise or fall relatively quickly. That makes it useful for balancing changing demand and variable renewable power. When reservoir elevation reduces maximum output, the grid loses part of that rapid response capability. Replacement electricity may exist somewhere else, but it must be available at the correct moment and able to reach customers across uncongested transmission lines. A distant power plant behind a full transmission corridor is not a complete replacement. A battery without enough stored energy cannot cover a long evening peak. A natural gas generator without fuel delivery cannot respond. The weak point may shift from the turbine to a transmission constraint hundreds of miles away. This is why hydropower is only the first failure. Its loss forces other components to carry more load. The same pattern extends downstream to Lake Mead. If Glen Canyon Dam cannot release water at the desired rate, Mead receives less inflow. Hoover Dam then faces its own elevation and hydropower constraints. Lower Mead levels affect intake structures serving Nevada, Arizona, California, and Mexico. Southern Nevada built a deep intake and low lake-level pumping station precisely because earlier intakes could become unusable as the reservoir fell. Those projects greatly improved resilience. They also required billions of dollars, years of construction, specialized tunneling, and enough institutional capacity to act before the emergency arrived. Not every community can build its way downward through rock. When a major city adapts, risk does not vanish from the basin. It may concentrate among smaller utilities, rural systems, tribal communities, agricultural districts, and ecosystems with fewer financial options. The weak point is not always where the largest population lives. It may be where the least adaptive capacity exists. There is a legal weak point as well. Water rules describe how much should move between parts of the basin, but contracts cannot force water through machinery beyond its physical capacity. The Colorado River Compact, later agreements, federal laws, court decisions, and treaties create obligations and expectations. Reservoir operations translate those expectations into releases. If low head limits the river outlet works, the gap between paper delivery and physical delivery becomes an operational conflict. Managers may be forced to choose among preserving elevation, supporting Lake Mead, meeting environmental flow needs, protecting infrastructure, and honoring existing agreements. The dam does not decide which legal interest matters most. It simply narrows the range of flows that can pass. Physics becomes a negotiating position. This is the point at which an engineering weak point becomes a governance weak point. The same shortage produces multiple legitimate demands. Upper basin states want to protect their ability to use water and meet compact obligations. Lower basin states depend on releases reaching Lake Mead. Tribal nations seek access to legally recognized water that many communities still lack infrastructure to use. Mexico depends on treaty deliveries. Environmental programs require flow patterns and water conditions for species and habitat. Power customers depend on affordable generation. Communities near the reservoir depend on drinking water and employment. At high storage, the system can partially separate these demands through timing and volume. Near critical elevations, one operational decision touches all of them. A small outlet valve becomes the physical point through which competing claims must pass. Another weak point is time. Major infrastructure cannot be redesigned at the speed of a falling forecast. Engineering studies, environmental review, funding, contracting, manufacturing, construction, testing, and permitting can take years. Reservoir elevation can lose many feet in a single bad season. Federal agencies can accelerate maintenance and develop interim operating guidance, but some options cannot be improvised after the threshold is crossed. New outlets cannot appear overnight. Turbines cannot be redesigned instantly for every low head condition. A community intake cannot be lowered after the existing pipe is already dry without emergency consequences. The most important spare part may be the year in which action should have begun. Once that year has passed, money alone may not restore it. This is why future projections matter, even when they remain uncertain. A forecast is not a promise. It is time offered for preparation. Dismissing it, because the exact elevation may change, wastes the one resource infrastructure cannot purchase later. Yet the system is not powerless. Reclamation can adjust releases, move water from upstream reservoirs, reline outlet works, study low elevation operations, improve monitoring, and coordinate with power customers. States and water users can conserve, compensate voluntary reductions, change irrigation practices, repair leaks, reuse water, and renegotiate operating rules. Utilities can improve pumps, intakes, backup power, and storage. Grid operators can add batteries, transmission, flexible generation, and demand response. Each action strengthens a component. The question is whether improvements occur across the entire chain before one strengthened link merely transfers the load to the next weak one. A deeper municipal intake protects drinking water, but does not increase basin runoff. Relined outlets improve reliability, but do not restore hydraulic head. Upstream releases protect Powell, but reduce upstream storage. Replacement electricity protects the grid, but may cost more and produce additional emissions. Reduced releases preserve elevation, but deliver less water toward Mead. Every adaptation solves a real problem. None solves all of them. That is what makes the weak point difficult to locate. It moves according to the action taken. The system is not a row of dominoes that must fall in one predetermined order. It is a network, redistributing pressure. When one route narrows, flow moves to another. When one reservoir is protected, another gives up storage. When one power source declines, another generator runs harder. When one city builds a deeper intake, another user may still lack basic access. The network can absorb stress for a long time, which is why collapse can appear unlikely. But absorption is not the same as recovery. The system may remain functional by consuming redundancy, money, stored water, worker attention, and political trust. Those resources are invisible until they are gone. Imagine the reservoir crossing below minimum power pool during a future winter. The turbines are taken out of normal operation. The outlets begin carrying releases. The first weeks may look controlled. Electricity is purchased elsewhere. Operators monitor vibration and pressure. Downstream flows continue. News coverage focuses on the loss of hydropower. Then one outlet requires inspection. Remaining capacity falls. A replacement component is delayed. Lake Powell continues descending, reducing head and outlet capacity. Managers reduce releases to protect control of the reservoir. Lake Mead receives less water. Power replacement costs rise during a heat wave. Upstream reservoirs are asked for additional support. Communities debate who should conserve more. Nothing in that sequence requires the dam to break. The infrastructure crisis is the progressive disappearance of options. But this is still a scenario, not a prediction. Lake Powell may remain above minimum power pool because of improved runoff, reduced releases, upstream support, conservation, or a combination of actions. The outlet works may perform reliably under extended use. Grid operators may replace the lost power without major disruption. The purpose of identifying the weak point is not to announce that failure is certain. It is to understand why crossing one elevation would change the system even if every professional involved performs competently. The warning does not come from imagining a concrete wall collapsing. It comes from watching a large river become dependent on 4 pipes, then 3, then perhaps fewer, while the pressure driving them continues to fall. This is not speculation without precedent. The Colorado River system has already approached critical elevations, activated emergency responses, moved water between reservoirs, changed release plans, and invested in deeper intakes and outlet repairs. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. To understand what the next decline could mean, we have to return to the moment Lake Powell first crossed a boundary managers had spent years trying to protect. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In March of 2022, Lake Powell fell below 3,525 feet for the first time since the reservoir was filled. The Bureau of Reclamation described that elevation as a target designed to preserve a 35-foot buffer above minimum power pool. Once the lake crossed below it, the event did not shut down Glen Canyon Dam, stop electricity generation, or interrupt every downstream delivery. What it did was more instructive. It forced federal operators to treat an elevation once discussed as a future contingency as a present operational condition. The reservoir was less than 35 vertical feet from the point where normal hydropower production could no longer continue. The warning had moved from a projection into the machinery. The fall below 3,525 feet did not come from one dry month. It emerged from a sequence. The Colorado River Basin had experienced years of drought, high temperatures, weak runoff efficiency, and declining storage. Lake Powell had been losing the cushion built during wetter decades. By September of 2021, federal projections indicated an almost 90% chance that the lake would reach the target elevation during the following year. Some modeling showed a possibility of falling below minimum power pool as early as the summer of 2022, if extremely dry hydrology continued. Those forecasts were not declarations that failure was certain. They were probability ranges. But the direction was clear enough for managers to prepare. Then the reservoir crossed the target line. The headline number was 3,525 feet. The operational response revealed the hidden number. Managers were no longer protecting only the water stored in Powell. They were protecting the distance between the water surface and the hydropower intakes. That distance represented electricity, release flexibility, compact compliance, revenue, and time. In May of 2022, the Department of the Interior announced an emergency action to hold back approximately 480,000 acre-feet of water in Lake Powell that otherwise would have been released during that water year. The annual release from Glen Canyon Dam was reduced from about 7.48 million acre-feet to approximately 7 million. At nearly the same time, operators began releasing roughly 500,000 acre-feet of additional water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir upstream. Combined, those actions were expected to protect close to 1 million acre-feet of water at Lake Powell relative to the previous plan. One part came from releasing less water toward Lake Mead. The other came from moving stored water out of an upstream reservoir. The intervention demonstrated that the system still had tools. It also demonstrated what those tools actually were. The basin could defend Powell only by changing the location and timing of scarcity. Less water released from Glen Canyon meant less water moving immediately toward Lake Mead. More water released from Flaming Gorge meant less water remaining in Wyoming and Utah for future operations. hydropower, recreation, fisheries, and drought protection. The action did not create 1 million acre-feet of runoff. It rearranged storage. This is the precedent that matters now. When Lake Powell approached critical infrastructure, managers did not find an untouched emergency supply outside the basin. They spent flexibility inside the system. The response succeeded at its immediate purpose. Lake Powell remained above minimum power pool. Hydropower production continued. Controlled releases continued through the turbines. The feared threshold was not crossed, but success can conceal the seriousness of the event. Because the system kept working, the intervention may look like proof that the risk was exaggerated. The opposite lesson is more accurate. The risk was serious enough to justify changing planned releases and drawing on upstream storage. The absence of failure was partly the result of action taken before failure. That distinction is essential in any infrastructure investigation. A bridge that remains open after emergency reinforcement was not necessarily safe without the reinforcement. A hospital that avoids overload after cancelling procedures was not operating under normal conditions. A reservoir that stays above minimum power pool after emergency transfers has not disproved the danger. It has shown the value and the cost of intervention. By the end of water year 2022, Glen Canyon Dam had produced approximately 2.59 million megawatt-hours of electricity, the lowest annual hydropower production in its operating record. That was not a complete power failure. The generators were still turning. Yet the record showed that declining elevation had already reached the grid before minimum power pool arrived. In water year 2023, generation improved to approximately 3.27 million megawatt-hours after better hydrology and higher releases. The difference between those 2 years was enough electricity to supply tens of thousands of typical American homes for a year. The precedent therefore confirms the gradual mechanism. Hydropower does not wait for one final threshold. It weakens on the descent. The lake loses head. The turbines produce less from the available flow. The power system replaces what is missing. Costs and operational burdens move outward. Then came the winter of 2022 into 2023. At the start of that season, the reservoir remained dangerously low. Federal projections placed the January 1st elevation near 3,522 feet, approximately 32 feet above minimum power pool. In January, the Bureau of Reclamation warned that Lake Powell was expected to fall below its previous post, filling record low of 3,522.24 feet. The agency also stated that the reservoir remained at risk of falling below minimum power pool later that year. Local drinking water had become part of the concern. Page and Lachey needed a deeper intake connection because their existing systems could become vulnerable if the reservoir approached dead pool. This was the moment when the crisis visibly expanded beyond electricity. The reservoir had not lost hydropower, yet engineers were already preparing for the possibility that community water infrastructure could lose access to the remaining lake. Then the pattern changed. The upper Colorado River Basin received an unusually strong snow season. The projected runoff improved sharply. By spring of 2023, federal operators increased the expected annual release from Glen Canyon Dam because more water was entering Powell. The lake began rising. Its elevation moved away from minimum power pool. The risk of crossing critical thresholds declined substantially. The recovery was real. It was also revealing. Lake Powell did not recover because the dam had been redesigned or because basin demand had permanently fallen into balance with supply. It recovered because the weather delivered a much larger inflow pulse. A strong snow year gave the system breathing room. It did not erase the structural exposure demonstrated the year before. That contrast is the most important historical lesson. 2022 showed what happens when the reservoir approaches the protected buffer. Managers reduce releases, draw from upstream storage, accept lower hydropower production, accelerate infrastructure work, and prepare for unfamiliar operating conditions. 2023 showed how quickly favorable hydrology can improve the picture. Together, the years prove both resilience and dependence. The system can respond, But much of its recovery still depends on water arriving from the sky in the correct place, in sufficient volume, and at the correct time. The precedent is not a straight line toward collapse. It is an oscillation between emergency and relief. That pattern can be more dangerous than a continuous decline because temporary recovery encourages the belief that the underlying problem has been solved. When the lake rises, boat ramps reopen, power production improves, and critical thresholds move farther away. Public attention shifts. Emergency negotiations lose urgency. Infrastructure projects compete with other priorities. Then, another weak runoff season arrives, and the system begins spending the same margins again. The danger is not only how low the lake falls in 1 year, it is whether each recovery rebuilds enough storage before the next decline begins. Consider what was different between the earlier emergency and the present warning. In 2022, Lake Powell fell below the protective elevation and approached minimum power pool, but the most severe outcomes remained concentrated in low-probability scenarios. Federal officials used emergency operations to hold the line. In early 2026, worsening runoff projections moved the possibility of reaching minimum power pool into the most probable federal scenario before new interventions were included. Later operational actions improved the projected elevation, but the change itself was significant. The threshold was no longer appearing only at the edge of an extremely dry model. It had moved toward the center of the forecast. That does not mean the reservoir will certainly cross it. Forecasts change. Releases can be adjusted. Upstream water can be moved. Summer precipitation may improve conditions. Future snow could restore storage. The difference is that the operating system now has less reason to treat the threshold as remote. It has already crossed the protective buffer once. It has already used upstream releases. It has already reduced planned deliveries. It has already experienced record low hydropower production. It has already built a deeper municipal intake. It has already begun major maintenance on the river outlet works. Each action leaves a physical or institutional record of what managers believe is possible. Historical precedent also exists downstream. Lake Mead has repeatedly approached elevations that threatened older intake structures and reduced hydropower production at Hoover Dam. Southern Nevada responded by constructing a third, deeper drinking water intake and a low lake-level pumping station capable of accessing water at elevations beyond the reach of earlier infrastructure. Those projects helped protect water service for the Las Vegas Valley. Their existence proves that a reservoir can still contain enormous volumes while older access systems become unusable. It also proves that adaptation can work when agencies have time, funding, technical capacity, and political support. But the solution required tunneling deep beneath Lake Mead, building a massive pumping station, and investing billions of dollars. The lesson is not that every community can simply install a lower pipe. The lesson is that the elevation of the intake can determine who still has water even before the reservoir is empty. Another precedent lies in dam engineering itself. Outlet works at large western dams have experienced cavitation damage under high-velocity releases in the past. The most famous example occurred at Glen Canyon Dam during the floods of 1983, when enormous releases through the spillways caused severe cavitation erosion. Crews detected shaking and damage, and emergency repairs and aeration modifications were required. That event involved the spillways, not the 4 river outlet tubes now central to low reservoir planning. The hydraulic conditions were different. It would be misleading to claim that low elevation outlet operation will repeat the 1983 spillway crisis. But the event proves the underlying engineering principle. High-velocity water can damage concrete and steel when flow conditions create cavitation, and small changes in geometry or aeration can determine whether a structure survives sustained load. The historical evidence supports caution, not prophecy. The present outlets have been inspected, studied, operated, and relined. Engineers understand much more about cavitation than they did decades ago. Still, no maintenance program can make hydraulic head return after the reservoir falls. The earlier drought also exposed a governance precedent. Emergency actions required coordination among the Bureau of Reclamation, Upper Basin states, the Upper Colorado River Commission, power customers, tribes, environmental programs, and lower basin interests. Every acre-foot held in Powell or released from Flaming Gorge affected another part of the system. Temporary agreements could respond to immediate danger, but they did not settle the long-term question of how a smaller river should be divided. The operating guidelines that shaped major reservoir decisions were written for a system with assumptions that no longer consistently match observed conditions. Negotiations over post-2026 rules therefore carry more than legal significance. They will determine which reservoir absorbs shortage, how quickly releases change, what elevations trigger action, and who bears the cost when hydrology fails to meet expectations. History has already shown that waiting until the lake reaches the turbine threshold leaves too little room. That is why the target elevation was set 35 feet higher. It was intended to create a response zone. Yet in 2022, the lake crossed that target anyway. The response zone became the response event. The experience demonstrated that buffers are useful only if action begins while the buffer still exists. Once the surface reaches the machinery, the question changes from prevention to continuity. Can power be replaced? Can water still pass? Can a valve be maintained? Can an upstream reservoir provide support? Can downstream deliveries be adjusted without producing another emergency? Those are more expensive questions than how to preserve the margin earlier. The lesson that has not been fully absorbed is that one wet year does not repay every form of debt created by a dry sequence. Snow can raise reservoir elevation, but it cannot automatically restore the water removed from upstream storage. It cannot reverse deferred maintenance, reimburse power customers, settle legal disagreements, rebuild ecological conditions, or guarantee the next winter. A wet year repairs volume faster than it repairs institutions. The lake may rise while the operating system remains dependent on emergency tools. That is why 2022 should not be remembered only as the year Lake Powell nearly lost hydropower. It should be remembered as the year the basin revealed its method of surviving the approach. Release less downstream, borrow water from upstream, accept record low generation, build deeper access, prepare lower outlets, hope the next snow season arrives before those measures run out. The method worked. The unresolved question is how many times it can be repeated. This is not evidence that history must repeat in exactly the same way. The current runoff, reservoir elevation, release plan, infrastructure condition, and legal environment are different. Future storms may change the forecast. Federal interventions may again prevent the lake from reaching minimum power pool, but the precedent establishes the mechanism beyond doubt. When Powell loses elevation, power declines before the turbines stop. When the buffer narrows, managers spend storage elsewhere. When access structures become threatened, communities must move their connection deeper. When the main pathway weakens, backup infrastructure becomes central. And when one favorable year arrives, the system can recover enough to postpone the question without answering it. The past does not tell us the date of the next failure. It tells us where the pressure will travel. That pressure begins at Lake Powell, but it does not remain there. It moves through the chain of reservoirs, the laws dividing the river, the grid replacing lost power, the farms planning around uncertain deliveries, and the cities investing to reach water at lower elevations. The precedent is no longer one reservoir approaching one line. It is a basin learning that every protective action in one location creates a consequence somewhere else. And that is where the story expands from a low lake into a system pattern. The system pattern becomes visible when Lake Powell is no longer treated as an isolated reservoir and is instead understood as one operating chamber inside a much larger machine. Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, Navajo Reservoir, Lake Powell, and Lake Mead are connected not only by water, but by timing, electricity, legal obligations, environmental requirements, and the expectation that storage in one place can compensate for shortage in another. For much of the 20th century, that architecture created stability. Wet years could be stored, dry years could be absorbed. Water could be released when farms, cities, and power systems needed it. The reservoirs turned a variable river into something closer to a schedule. The emerging problem is that the schedule was built around a river behaving more generously than it has in recent decades. This is not only a reservoir decline, it is a calendar failure, an infrastructure test, and a recovery problem spreading across the basin. The first change is hydrologic. Warmer conditions increase the amount of water lost before precipitation becomes runoff. Snow can fall in the mountains and still produce a disappointing river because dry soil absorbs more meltwater, vegetation uses more moisture, and the atmosphere pulls more water back through evaporation and transpiration. A basin does not need to receive zero precipitation to experience severe shortage. It only needs a smaller percentage of that precipitation to reach the channel. That is why an ordinary-looking winter can produce an extraordinary reservoir outcome. The old calendar assumed that snow accumulated through winter, melted through spring, and delivered a large, relatively reliable pulse into the river. The new pattern is less dependable. Snow may melt earlier, runoff may peak sooner, soil may claim more water, heat may extend the season of loss. The reservoir receives less of what the weather map appeared to promise. The second change is the condition in which dry years now arrive. A drought year falling on a full system is a management problem. A drought year falling on depleted reservoirs is an infrastructure problem. The same shortage creates different consequences depending on the starting elevation. When Powell and Mead hold large reserves, operators can release water, generate power, and wait for recovery. When both are low, every decision consumes a larger share of what remains. 1 weak runoff season can undo several years of careful conservation. 1 strong snow year can create relief without restoring the storage lost across a long dry sequence. The system begins to resemble a household using savings to cover repeated emergencies. A good month slows the decline. It does not rebuild the account. The third change is that response capacity itself can become overloaded. Federal operators can reduce releases from Lake Powell. They can move water from Flaming Gorge. Lower basin users can conserve. Farmers can fallow fields. Cities can reuse wastewater, repair leaks, and change landscaping. Power agencies can purchase replacement electricity. Engineers can deepen intakes and strengthen outlet works. Every one of those actions matters, but each action belongs to a different institution, budget, legal authority, and timetable. The river can deteriorate faster than the system can coordinate. Infrastructure moves slowly, contracts move slowly, court cases move slowly. Reservoir elevation does not. That mismatch is a form of risk. The system may know what adaptation is needed and still fail to complete it before the next low water year arrives. This is where the idea of a new baseline becomes important, but it must be used carefully. 1 dry year does not establish a permanent future. 1 wet year does not restore the past. Climate models, tree ring records, observed warming, and recent hydrology all indicate that the Colorado River Basin can experience long droughts and highly variable runoff. The strongest evidence does not support a simple claim that every future year will be worse than the last. It supports a more difficult conclusion. The range of plausible conditions has shifted, and the cost of being wrong has increased because storage is lower. The old baseline assumed that extreme low runoff years would be occasional shocks, separated by enough recovery. The emerging risk is that recovery intervals may be shorter, weaker, or less reliable. The danger is not only a new average, it is a system receiving less time to rebuild between loads. That changes how infrastructure should be judged. Glen Canyon Dam was designed to operate across a range of reservoir elevations, but not to spend indefinite periods near the bottom of that range, while still carrying every function assigned to it. River outlet works were built to release water, but not necessarily to become the permanent main passage for the Colorado River. Upstream reservoirs were built to provide storage and power, but not to serve repeatedly as emergency support for Powell without cost. Municipal intakes were placed at elevations that once appeared secure. Hydropower contracts were shaped around generation levels that assumed more head and more water. Agricultural systems developed around deliveries supported by large reservoirs. each component may still work. The pattern is that more components are being pushed toward the edge of their design assumptions at the same time. The weak point can therefore migrate. In 1 year, it may be Lake Powell's elevation. In another, it may be Lake Mead's intake system. During a heat wave, it may be replacement electricity. During a maintenance period, it may be one outlet tube. During negotiations, it may be the absence of an agreement governing shortage. During a poor snow season, it may be the upstream reservoir expected to release water it cannot easily spare. The system does not need every component to fail. It needs only one critical function to lose enough flexibility that the remaining components cannot compensate. This is why the future cannot be understood through a single threshold. Minimum power pool is important, but it is not the only line. There are elevations at which generation declines. There are elevations at which intakes become vulnerable. There are storage levels that trigger operating rules. There are flow rates below which ecosystems change. There are financial thresholds at which replacement power becomes difficult to absorb. There are political thresholds at which voluntary conservation becomes harder to maintain. The river system is crossed by invisible lines long before dead pool. Some are physical, some are legal, some are economic, some are social. The most dangerous condition is when several are crossed close together. The geographic pattern may shift as well. The first visible crisis may appear at Lake Powell, but the consequences can move upstream and downstream. An emergency release from Flaming Gorge can protect Powell while reducing flexibility in Wyoming and Utah. A smaller release from Powell can preserve hydropower elevation while delivering less water toward Mead. A decline at Mead can increase pressure on Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico. Agricultural reductions can affect national food supply chains. Higher power costs can reach customers far from the canyon. Tribal communities may face a double burden, holding legally recognized rights while lacking the infrastructure to use them fully during the period when the basin is renegotiating scarcity. The map shows reservoirs. The system pattern shows the movement of risk between communities. The seasonal pattern is changing too. Water managers traditionally focus on winter snowpack and spring runoff, but the danger now extends across the entire year. Autumn soil moisture can influence how much spring melt becomes river flow. Warm winter storms can produce rain instead of snow at some elevations. Early spring heat can accelerate melt. Summer heat can raise evaporation and electricity demand. Wildfire can alter watersheds, increasing erosion and changing water quality. A weak monsoon can deepen dry conditions. The reservoir crisis is no longer confined to the month when snowpack is measured. It is built through the previous autumn, revealed during spring, accelerated through summer, and carried into the next winter. The preparation calendar must expand because the mechanism does not reset on January 1st. The governance calendar must change as well. Temporary emergency actions are valuable, but temporary actions cannot substitute indefinitely for a durable operating framework. Every year spent debating who should reduce use is another year in which the physical system continues moving. Agreements written around fixed delivery expectations become harder to maintain when the river provides less water than the paper system distributes. Yet abandoning rules is not a solution. The basin needs rules precisely because scarcity increases conflict. The challenge is to create operating agreements that respond to actual hydrology, protect critical infrastructure before thresholds are reached, distribute reductions transparently, recognize tribal rights, preserve essential ecological functions, and avoid transferring every cost to communities with the least political power. That is not merely a water allocation problem. It is a design problem for an entire regional system. There is still room for agency. Urban water use can become more efficient. Agricultural conservation can be compensated, rather than imposed, without support. Infrastructure can be modified. Power systems can add storage and flexible generation. Forecasting can improve. Reservoir rules can respond earlier to declining conditions. Watershed restoration can help in some locations, though it cannot replace missing precipitation at basin scale. Tribal water infrastructure can be funded. States can negotiate reductions before crisis eliminates voluntary choices. These actions will not return the river to an earlier climate. They can determine whether lower flows produce managed adaptation or uncontrolled failure. That distinction is the remaining margin. The future of Lake Powell will not be decided by one snow season alone. It will be decided by whether the basin uses temporary relief to rebuild flexibility or uses it to postpone decisions. A wet year can raise the lake. Only policy, infrastructure, conservation, and time can raise the system's resilience. A dry year can reveal the weak point. Only preparation can prevent that weak point from becoming the place where the entire network loses control. This is why the falling reservoir line matters, even if hydropower never fully stops. It is showing that the Colorado River system is being asked to perform 21st century work with 20th century assumptions. The old calendar expected recovery. The new risk is that recovery may arrive too late, too weakly, or in the wrong place. And before any conclusion is drawn from that pattern, one final task remains. We must separate what the evidence proves from what it does not, because the warning is already serious enough without turning uncertainty into prophecy. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Lake Powell is low. The runoff feeding it has been severely reduced. Federal operators have prepared extraordinary measures to keep the reservoir above critical elevations. Glen Canyon Dam produces less power as hydraulic head declines, and its ability to release water becomes more constrained if the reservoir falls below minimum power pool. Those statements are supported by observed measurements, engineering, and official projections. But evidence also places limits on what can honestly be said. A forecast is not a photograph of the future. Lake Powell could fall below 3,490 feet, but no responsible analysis can promise the exact date. Rain, snow, temperature, release changes, upstream operations, conservation, and forecast revisions can alter the trajectory. The reservoir may remain above the threshold. It may cross it briefly. It may recover after a stronger runoff season. None of those possibilities erases the warning visible today. They define the boundary between risk and certainty. It is also not accurate to say that crossing minimum power pool would immediately stop all water moving through Glen Canyon Dam. The hydropower turbines could no longer perform their normal role, but lower river outlet works would still provide a pathway under many conditions. The problem is that those outlets have different capacities and become less capable as the reservoir continues falling. Minimum power pool is not dead pool. Dead pool is not an empty reservoir. These elevations mark different losses of function. Confusing them creates a more dramatic story, but a less useful one. The real danger is progressive. First, hydropower output declines. Then normal generation may stop. Backup outlets carry more responsibility. Their capacity falls with hydraulic head. Maintenance becomes harder to schedule. Release flexibility narrows. Farther down, near dead pool, the dam approaches a condition where it may be unable to release substantially more water than the river is delivering into the reservoir. The structure does not need to collapse for control to weaken. Nor can every problem across the Southwest be blamed on Lake Powell. A high electricity bill may reflect fuel prices, transmission constraints, market conditions, local rates, extreme heat, or many other factors. A farm may reduce acreage because of economics, groundwater rules, labor costs, crop prices, or water policy unrelated to one reservoir elevation. A municipal water failure may come from an aging pipe or pump rather than Colorado River storage. Events can occur at the same time without sharing one cause. The evidence line matters because system risk becomes easy to distort when many pressures overlap. The honest claim is not that Lake Powell directly causes every hardship. It is that lower storage removes one source of flexibility from systems already managing other pressures. The same boundary applies to climate. No single weak runoff year can be attributed entirely to climate change. Natural variability remains powerful in the Colorado River Basin. Storm tracks shift, ocean patterns influence precipitation. One winter can be exceptionally wet after several dry years, yet it would also be wrong to treat warming as irrelevant. United States Geological Survey research has found that higher temperatures reduce runoff efficiency in the upper Colorado River basin. Warmer air increases evaporation and plant water use. Snow can melt earlier. Dry soils can absorb more water before it reaches streams. The conclusion is not that climate change determines every snowstorm. The conclusion is that warming changes how much river the same precipitation can produce. Weather decides much of the annual sequence. Climate changes the background conditions through which that sequence must travel. Another line must be drawn around the historical record. Lake Powell has approached critical elevations before, and emergency action helped keep it above minimum power pool. That precedent proves the mechanism and the usefulness of intervention. It does not prove that every future response will succeed, nor does it prove that failure is inevitable. Upstream releases, lower annual discharges, conservation, maintenance, and improved forecasting can protect the reservoir. But these tools have limits. Water moved from Flaming Gorge is no longer stored at Flaming Gorge. Water retained in Powell does not reach Mead at the same time. Replacement power consumes money or capacity elsewhere. Deeper intakes preserve access, but do not increase the river's total supply. Adaptation is real. So are its costs. The central risk is therefore not a single catastrophic moment. It is the repeated use of temporary measures without enough recovery between them. A system can survive one emergency by spending stored water. It can survive another by changing releases. It can survive another by purchasing power and delaying maintenance elsewhere. From the outside, continuity looks like stability. From inside the system, continuity may be the result of reserves being consumed. This is not just a hydropower failure. This is a river delivery system losing its operating margin. That sentence does not predict collapse. It identifies what the falling elevation is already changing. The Colorado River system has fewer easy choices than it once had. Lake Powell can no longer absorb every dry sequence without approaching infrastructure thresholds. Upstream reservoirs cannot provide unlimited rescue water. Lake Mead cannot receive less indefinitely without facing its own constraints. Cities and farms cannot reduce use without economic and social consequences. Legal agreements cannot distribute water that the basin does not produce. Engineering cannot repeal gravity. But none of this means the future has already been decided. Demand can fall. Agreements can change. Tribal water infrastructure can finally receive long-delayed investment. Agricultural reductions can be designed with compensation rather than imposed through sudden collapse. Cities can continue conservation without waiting for taps to fail. Power systems can add storage, transmission, and other flexible resources before hydropower disappears. Outlet works can be repaired, monitored, and modified. Reservoir rules can trigger action earlier, while meaningful buffers still exist. The choice is not between preserving the 20th century exactly as it was and abandoning the river entirely. The choice is whether adaptation begins while the system still has options. Return now to the official display where this story began. The screen shows one elevation measured in feet above sea level. The line may rise slightly after a storm or fall during a week of heavy releases. A new forecast may move the projected threshold forward or backward. Those movements will matter, but the most important information is not contained in one daily reading. It is contained in the shrinking distance between the reservoir surface and the machinery below it, in the amount of outside intervention required to preserve that distance, and in the number of other systems waiting downstream. The headline will focus on whether Lake Powell sets a new record low. Records are easy to understand because they create a clean comparison with the past. Infrastructure does not wait for a record. Power generation weakens before the lowest elevation is reached. Budgets tighten before a turbine stops. Upstream storage declines before Powell crosses the line. Engineers prepare outlet pipes before they become the main route. Families adjust costs before a utility announces an emergency. The record is an event. The loss of margin is a process. That process is what the lake has revealed. Someday, the current dry period will end. Snow will return in greater amounts during some winters. Lake Powell may rise many feet. Photographs may show water covering surfaces that are exposed today. Hydropower production may improve. The immediate alarm may fade from public attention. But the system will not return automatically to the assumptions under which it was built. The basin will remain warmer. Demands and legal claims will remain. Reservoirs will still need enough storage to survive the next dry sequence. Outlet structures will still have physical limits. Every acre-foot used to avoid one emergency will still be unavailable for another purpose. The event will pass, but the thing it revealed will remain. A system built around old assumptions is being tested by a river, no longer following the old calendar. The future will not be decided only by whether Lake Powell crosses 3,490 feet this year. It will be decided by whether 7 states, tribal nations, Mexico, federal agencies, farms, cities, power customers, and communities can act before the remaining margin becomes too small to share. The final question is not whether the Colorado River will disappear tomorrow. It will not. The question is more operational and more difficult. When the next weak runoff arrives, will the system still have stored water, functioning machinery, affordable power, trusted agreements, and enough time to recover before the next load reaches it?